Hi, Michael.
Hi, Byron.
How are you today?
I'm okay. How about you?
Beautiful spring day.
So it is.
Fine. Beautiful
So it
spring
is.
day in
Yeah.
the nation's capital. Better than it was in Pennsylvania, as a matter of fact. I should say right at the beginning, this will make Bob Wright happy. For the first time ever, I had people come up to me and say, "Hey, I saw you on Blogging Heads."
Wow.
Which is now they were both in Berkeley, California,
Uh-huh.
but they could not have been nicer. And it was very good, and they like Blogging Heads a lot. So that's the Blogging Heads plug to start off with.
Yeah, well, see, the creative class redeems itself after all, see? See?
Now, Pennsylvania, just to tell you, I went up there, I guess, on Saturday, and attended Hillary Clinton rallies, one in a place called California, Pennsylvania. Did you know there was a place called California, Pennsylvania?
I sure did. There's a place called Indiana, Pennsylvania, too. I know.
And it's nearby a place called 84, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I know
met
that, too.
people in California who were from 84. Anyway, did Hillary Clinton. It is in Washington County, which I believe went 71% for Hillary Clinton. It's also an area that people sometimes refer to as Pennsyltucky. For its sort of white working class status. I also went to a Hillary rally completely across the state in Bethlehem, which I have to confess kind of startling ignorance about. It conjured up images of shuttered steel mills and depressed areas, but Bethlehem was actually a lovely, lovely place.
Yeah.
And liked it a lot. And then just because of the schedule, I went back across the state to Washington County again. And saw a Obama rally in a place called McKeesport.
Yeah, sure.
Which I thought would be interesting because it was that same sort of Hillary Clinton voter base.
Yeah.
And then back to Philadelphia for Hillary's victory. Some of the interesting things there. Talked to a lot of Hillary Clinton supporters in California, the people who were at the rally. And why do you like Hillary Clinton? It's almost everybody says it's experience.
Right.
Why her over Barack Obama? Because of experience. We chat for a while longer, and then I say, if Obama wins the nomination, will you vote for Obama? More than half the people said no.
Wow.
And some of them said it quite emphatically. Now, you might think that this is, it's the heat of the race, and it's not unusual for people to say they would never support the other guy. Now, then I go in the same area, nearby McKeesport, to an Obama rally. And why do you like Barack Obama? Change. New, fresh. If Hillary Clinton is the nominee, will you vote for her? And almost all of them, except one, nearly every one of them, said yes.
Sure.
So I got the idea from this completely unscientific poll that this "I won't vote for the other guy" is a little bit of a one-way street, or was in this area of Pennsyltucky. And as I said, Washington County, I think, went 71% for Clinton. There's a precinct in Washington County called Allenport, where they are closing down a steel mill. I think about 300 employees are still there just sitting around waiting for the closing date.
Yeah.
And it went, I believe, 86% for Clinton. So, I'm not sure what to make of all this. I did an article in National Review recently about the black vote in Obama, and which is also about the white vote in Obama.
Yeah.
And so you wonder, is this, and all the analysts I would talk to for this article said, it's class. 92% of black people in Mississippi voted for Obama, 91% of blacks in Wisconsin, 90% of blacks in Pennsylvania, and on white terms, 70% of whites in Mississippi, 64% of whites in Ohio, and 63% of whites in Pennsylvania vote for her. So it looks kind of racial, and everybody says, no, it's class.
Yeah, sure.
But I got to think there's some racial factors involved here. What do you think?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I know some of these portions of Pennsylvania that you're talking about I know pretty well. I grew up in Morgantown, West Virginia. It's pretty close to Little Washington, as we call it over there, as we used to call it. So all those counties in southwestern Pennsylvania, Greene, Fayette, Somerset, Bedford, Washington, I've spent a lot of time in those counties, just driving through, doing things, this and that. Had relatives in some of those places, Uniontown, around there. I know those places pretty well. I don't want to cast any aspersions on people in a blanket way without, having gone there and done the empirical research. But look, let's not kid ourselves. Race is obviously a factor here, and it's going to be a factor in more places than southwestern Pennsylvania. So sure, of course, this is a big problem, and I agree with you that it is kind of a one-way street, this question of what's going to happen, who people are going to support in November. Now, I don't necessarily believe what everybody says in April about what they're going to do in November, and if Obama's the nominee, he'll have time to work on that. But here's his problem that's happened in the last 3-4 weeks. Think back to the Obama of, certainly of Iowa, or even the Obama of Wisconsin on February 19th or 20th or something like that. That was the Obama who who transcended race and who made all these old categories in some sense moot. That Obama still exists for many, many millions of people, but it's now competing. He is now competing with the Obama, the Jeremiah Wright Obama, and the Obama, who doesn't wear a lapel pin and all of these kinds of things. So he's got a problem there. There's no question about it, and it's partly a racial problem. Now, as I say, can he, if he's the nominee, become that old Obama again? Can he become the guy who transcended race? That is going to be the key question for him as to whether he can be competitive in November, I think. And I still think it's possible. I could still see him. I could still see him winning. I think McCain has a lot of vulnerabilities that haven't been fleshed out yet. But it's true that I can't remember who I read some months ago saying this, but it remains true. Obama is capable either of a big win or a big loss, and I think we've now seen lately more of the details of the potential of the big loss being filled in.
Well, now, isn't it in the interest, now they could never say this, but isn't it in the interest of the Clinton campaign to hope that more whites vote along racial lines?
Yeah.
Look, as I said, Mississippi, 92% of blacks vote for Obama. 91% in Wisconsin, a very different place. 90% in Pennsylvania. And this is not Republican versus Democrats, where we've historically seen, at least in the last couple of generations, blacks go 90+% for the Democratic candidate. This is an inside the party contest among two candidates who really don't have. There's not all that much difference between them in terms of policy.
Right.
So I think you can say that it appears that black voters are voting along racial lines, and it's a kind of an incendiary topic, to use a word that's often associated with Reverend Wright. But Hillary does better if she can in some way encourage white voters to do the same thing. And I will say, I spoke to someone who was kind of connected loosely to the Clinton campaign about a week ago. Mm-hmm. And I brought up this very topic, and this person didn't disagree, and they said, all that stuff Bill was saying in South Carolina before the primary, maybe it was a long-term investment.
Yeah.
And so is this kind of the sort of dirty underside of what is going on in this campaign?
Probably so. I don't have much doubt that Bill Clinton knew what he was saying when he said that stuff about Jesse Jackson. I think I knew exactly what he was saying. There were other examples from back in that time that were remarked upon contemporaneously, too, that I don't really remember, but there were 2 or 3 other examples of that kind of thing. But sure, look, and the simple fact is there are more white voters than there are black voters, in every state in the Union, or virtually every state in the Union, and virtually every state remaining. And the crucial one is Indiana, I guess. So sure, it benefits her to do that. Now, here's a question that I'd like to raise, because I probably have a slightly different view than you or other people. I don't know. Where would you put the odds right now, or if you had to assign percentages, on a scale of 100, is it still 85-15 likely that Obama's going to be the nominee, or 80-20? What do you think?
Well, I'm trying to think of what numbers I would assign to it. Let me just go through the factors.
Yeah.
Obviously, he's ahead in delegates, number of states, and popular vote, although the Clinton campaign has been making a popular vote argument in the last couple of days, which includes Florida and Michigan.
Right.
But on the other hand, if he's nominated, you have the rather, I think, bizarre, and I should look into this, but probably unprecedented in modern politics, possibility of a Democratic nominee who didn't win Pennsylvania, didn't win Ohio, didn't win New York, didn't win New Jersey, didn't win California, didn't win Texas, didn't win Florida. It's a very odd situation.
Yeah.
So, and then the other thing is, I do think the Florida and Michigan things are not over. This is a party that went nuts, about 347 votes in Florida in 2000.
Right.
And to believe that they will simply not count the votes of 1.7 million Democrats in Florida, another 600,000 Democrats who voted in Michigan. And I agree that Michigan is completely illegitimate. It's just a mess because Obama's name wasn't on the ballot. But Florida struck me as a legitimate result. Anyway, those are things that the Obama campaign can't put aside. And then the other thing, the last factor that's really popped out after Pennsylvania is Hillary Clinton's unbelievable relentlessness and stamina.
Mm-hmm.
You probably heard when Stephen Colbert the other day said, you cut off her legs, you cut off her arms, you cut off her head, and she will crawl toward you using the muscles of her belly button. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And I think that has impressed a lot of Democrats.
Yeah.
And so the fight and the relentlessness has really, I think, proven quite a contrast to Obama, who is still seen as a bit intellectual and above the fray.
Yeah.
Even though they've been getting in it some. So you put all those factors together, and the last factor is the rules. You know, Obama people say, look, these are the rules. I mean, he followed the rules. He went to these caucus states. Hillary ignored them. I mean, she could have gone in and contested them.
Right.
Everybody knew the rules going in. And in Florida, it was just the rules. It's what the Democratic Party had agreed upon. My feeling is, since when have they worried about the rules? I don't think they worried about the rules in Florida in 2000. I remember in New Jersey when what was his name? Torricelli, Bob Torricelli,
yeah,
dumped out after the date where the Democratic Party could field a new candidate. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, they went crazy about that and went to court and got Frank Lautenberg on the ballot. He is in the Senate today. So I think, you know, when the rules, when it comes to the rules and enfranchising people, Democrats seem to me to have always been in favor of the enfranchisement, regardless of what the rules say. So I think we're still in for some fights on this. And
so do a number.
At least 25%. I'll give her a 25% chance of winning.
25, yeah. Well, you know, I think it's higher. I think it's like 60-40 Obama, which I know is an outlier. But here's why. For all the reasons you say, which I think are mostly all valid reasons, but I would add this, a couple of things, I guess. One thing I would add is that lately the Clinton campaign has just been spinning circles around the Obama campaign. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the Obama campaign, you know, they have some arguments to make that I think that they're not making very effectively. Well, you know, I don't think they're making the argument about the popular vote as effectively as they could be. I don't think they're combating her. I think they're losing the Florida and Michigan argument badly, particularly the Florida argument. And you know, there are some things they could be saying there about the fact that, you know, the Clinton campaign basically agreed that it wasn't going to, you know, they weren't going to campaign there, and it essentially wasn't going to count. You know. They're not doing a very good job with their own counterspin, and I think they're getting circles run around them. And that leads to point 2, which is this. Today we say that the superdelegates overturning the will of the people as expressed through all these accumulated pledged delegates over the course of all these different contests would be something that would be, you know, heinous and terrible and illegitimate and a high crime. We say this today, and you know that's probably true, and it gets particularly sensitive in the Democratic Party when the leader happens to be African American. There's no question about that. So there's that element in there too. But I just wonder, we say it today, but by the morning of June 4th, if they've basically split the rest of these races, if Obama hasn't won Indiana, and by the way, I think if he wins North Carolina and Indiana on May 6th, I think it's essentially done. But if he doesn't,
if he just wins North Carolina and she wins Indiana,
yeah, then she keeps going. I mean, you don't lose a race, and you don't lose a contest and get out of the race. That seems fair to me. So if they keep splitting these things down the road, and by the end his pledged delegate lead is under 100. Let's say, for example, and I haven't run the math lately. I haven't been on the Slate delegate calculator in a while, so I haven't really kept abreast of the numbers. But let's say his pledged delegate lead is under 100. The popular vote question is sufficiently fuzzy because Clinton has been winning and will continue to win the spin war on the popular vote. Well, and he hasn't won an important race in a little while. Well, then it's going to... I just have a feeling that the conventional wisdom on this question of overturning the will of the people, it might change. And, and then finally, the last thing that we know about the Clintons is what you said when your allusion to Colbert. And, they'll keep fighting, and they'll take it to the convention. They'll do whatever it is they need to do. And they'll just do it on the assumption that they can prevail and that they can fix things with black voters later, either by offering Obama the vice presidency or by doing something else. But I think that they'll just think, they think of today, and let's do what we have to do today, and we'll fix the problem with the black voters later. So, I think that, in some... If he can't shut it down on May 6th, then I think, he's got a very serious problem on his hands.
Now, is there some way, the conventional wisdom is that under any scenario, if Clinton gets the nomination now with everything that's happened, that black Democrats will be extremely angry because it was stolen from Obama, that they moved the goalpost so many times. I think it was Gene Robinson who wrote today, they've moved the goalpost so many times that they're out in the parking lot of the stadium now. And that black Democrats will be so angry over this that there's going to be real electoral problems with the nominee. Now, the question is, if that were to happen, do you think that the Clintons could actually smooth things over enough to run an effective general election campaign?
They could. I don't want to cop out, but it just sort of depends on how it happens. If it happens in some really dramatically kind of dubious and scuzzy fashion in Denver itself, where emotions are high and it does really seem stolen, well, that's going to be a tough one. However, there are other ways that it can happen. Let's say... just hypothetically, and I have no idea who this person would be, but let's say one prominent African American leader or a couple step forward and say that they're for Clinton. Then that could change the perception of it. So it just depends on how it happens. So I could see all kinds of different things unfolding, but there's no question that the potential is there. For black voters to stay home. And I want to make another, not insignificant number, but in some number. And I want to make another point here that I think has been overlooked. As I look through these state results and these county-by-county results that you alluded to a little while ago, talking about some of the counties in western Pennsylvania, the counter-argument to that is this. Clinton isn't going to win those counties in November if she's the nominee against John McCain, right? You look at all those rural counties in central and northern Pennsylvania, across Interstate 80, across the top of the state. McCain's going to win all those counties. Clinton might get a decent vote out of some of them, but she's going to lose them. McCain's going to win them. She's going to have to win Pennsylvania, for example, in exactly the places where, she kind of lost to Barack Obama or sort of ran competitively. She's going to have to win Pennsylvania with a big, big turnout and a big, big margin in Philadelphia and Delaware and Chester and Montgomery and to some extent Bucks counties. Now, she won Montgomery, but just 51-49, but she won it. But in other words, she's going to have to win these states by winning in the places where she lost to Obama. And this is true not just of Pennsylvania, but it's true of Ohio, it's true of Wisconsin, it's true of a lot of states. We could go down the list. That means, to some extent, black voters, of course, to a considerable extent. And it also means, college-educated liberal voters who are Obama people. So, she's going to have to win those voters over. She is not going to carry Lycoming County, I can tell you.
Mm-hmm. Well, so, but, I mean, who has the better argument? Looking at, and I talked to, at the victory thing in Philadelphia, I talked to Ann Lewis, who's a Clinton advisor.
Right.
And she was making the argument that the Clinton campaign has made many times, which is, obviously a Democratic presidential candidate is going to have to win Florida, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, or some big combination thereof. And she's got a better case to make for that than Obama does. And what's wrong with that argument?
I don't think there's anything wrong with that argument. Again, there's a counter-argument, which is that if you just look down the list of polls today, you see that even today, on a losing streak, and, Jeremiah Wrighted up and Bill Ayers up and all this stuff, even today, there are a small number of states that Obama leads McCain in where Clinton is behind McCain. And these tend to be Great Lakes states, Midwest states, things like that. Iowa is one. Minnesota is one. I think Wisconsin is another. To some extent, the Mountain West. This is true in Colorado. I think he's closer in, like, Montana. Not that there's much electoral action there. But if you take all these states and put them all together, they do amount to a respectable number of electoral votes. Now, if you put a gun to my head and said, who is it easier to see 270 for? You would say her by dint of, having the more traditional Democratic map, being closer to being able to pull off that more traditional Democratic map. But he has the potential to reach into some states that are also really important to Democrats and that people forget about a little bit. And I'm thinking, for example, particularly, they're not huge electorally, but they're pretty big. They're reasonably big. Minnesota and Wisconsin, which people count as blue by reputation, but I think Kerry beat Bush by 90-something thousand in Minnesota and by 10,000 in Wisconsin.
Yeah, really tight.
Yeah, and those are really, really gettable states for John McCain, in my view.
And Obama won Missouri, right?
Yeah, he did win Missouri, and if you look at that map, it's a joke. It's completely like the Kerry-Bush map of Missouri in 2004. Obama only won Kansas City, St. Louis, and Columbia, where the university is, and I guess maybe Jefferson City, the capital. But so he won like 5 counties out of however many counties there are in Missouri. But that's enough, and I know that from my experience as a reporter in New York, which has 62 counties, and which a Democrat can win by carrying only 5 or 6 of them.
Wait a minute. I had. I want to ask you another thing. There was where you were a signer of a letter.
Yeah.
I forget who it was. Was it to the Disney company, the head of ABC News?
Yeah, I don't even know who it was to. It's just like an open letter,
It was an open letter, and it was protesting the handling of the debate. The Philadelphia debate that was moderated by Charles Gibson and George Stephanopoulos.
Yeah.
But it seemed to me that debate, that the first 45 minutes, the notorious first 45 minutes, really focused on these kind of, in a broad sense, character questions that a lot of people make their decisions on, especially when, again, you have these two candidates, and they're just not that far different from each other. I have a hard time figuring out exactly how they're different on Iraq, because I don't think either one of them is going to be able to do what they say they do. The difference on universal health care is, I guess substantial if you have it under the umbrella of universal health care. But I thought all these other questions, people make their decision to vote for president on basis of a bunch of intangible judgments about the character of these people. And a lot of times they don't do it on specific policies. My friend, because you don't know what's going to happen, to the president. My friend David Frum says, and I think he got this idea firsthand in the White House, is, a president is elected to do one thing. In 2000, the president was elected to dispose of our fabulous surplus by, initiating tax cuts. And then on September 11th, it became a presidency about something completely else, different. And Frum says, you have the president, he's elected to do this and to do that, and then 3 months later, an enormous world historic meteorite hits, the heartland. It kills thousands of people, and it immediately becomes the meteorite presidency.
Yeah.
So in other words, you pick a president to deal with all sorts of things that you don't even know are coming up. And that's why I thought the first part of that debate was actually kind of useful, because it just gave people an idea. And I think now with Clinton, there has arisen this idea that she's unbelievably resilient and relentless and dedicated. And I think that may be working in her favor.
Yeah.
So what's wrong with things like the first part of that debate that give us clues to what kind of people these people are as opposed to their specific policy proposals?
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with, obviously, the way you frame that question, there's nothing wrong with finding out what kind of people these people are. We have to find that out. And I'm also, I'm not a wonk particularly, so, I don't really want to sit up there and hear them, I don't want to hear them stand up there and talk about how they're going to reduce the trade deficit. I'm not, I'm interested in that question as a function of their overall economic views, but I don't want to listen to them talk about that for 10 minutes. However, I'd say this. There are questions that, to me, there are questions that are really legitimate about that, and there are questions that are a little bit irrelevant about that. And, Jeremiah Wright, that is totally fair. He really has to deal with that, and he's going to have to deal with it if he's the nominee right up through November 4th, and that's completely legitimate. And I gather that the Reverend Wright is not giving him much help in his interview with Moyers tonight, at least from the snippets that have been released so far. So Wright is completely fair game.
Okay, so those questions
obviously, asking him about his comments from San Francisco, the bitter comments, that's completely fair game too. I just felt, and the reason I signed the thing is that I felt that there was just too much emphasis on that kind of thing. And, I also disagree. Here's an assertion that, like, a lot of people who defended that debate made that I disagree with. A lot of people who defend that debate up and down say, but all these things have been asked. We've heard them talk about Iraq. We've heard them talk about health care. We've heard them talk about this. We've heard them talk about that. Well, to be sure, I can see that argument to some extent. But there's a lot of stuff that we just haven't really heard them talk about very much at all. And, questions tend to be framed in these debates in a sort of got-you kind of way. And, the other thing about the debate that I thought was even, to me was more annoying than the lapel pin stuff was the way the substantive questions were framed about, like, will you pledge? Will you pledge today? Right. The blah, 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 blah. I think that's silly, and I think that's nonsense. And I think that, you can't, nobody can predict the future. So, that question is framed that way only for one reason, so that in the future, when the person is president, they can come back and say, so-and-so either broke their pledge, number one, or number two, they're being an idiot because they're sticking to something they said 2 years ago, which obviously no longer applies to the reality of this situation. So, I think that will you pledge, and we specifically added language to that effect, because that was really annoying too. So, there are a lot of questions about executive power and about how to go after terrorism and about, just a long list of things that I really haven't heard them asked at these debates, and that, I think people actually, call me naive, Byron, but some of these things,
Michael.
Some of these things, that's fine. I actually think that more people are more interested in some of these questions than they are in whether they wear lapel pins.
All right, I want to kind of keep zooming in on this. So basically, you say that the Jeremiah Wright question and the bitter questions are both okay. Yep. So really, I think what irritated you, if we try to focus on what the problems were, with the flag pin questions and the Bill Ayers questions. Is that fair to say?
I would say there's a dividing line in my mind between right and bitter on the one hand and Ayers and lapel pins on the other, yes.
Okay, well, in my humble opinion, the flag pin question is a dumb issue. It's not a question, it's a non-issue. I remember the day after, or a couple of days after, I went to Yahoo News Photos, just picked up all the photos of McCain in recent days, walking around, giving a speech here, meeting with CEOs there, all that stuff. Wearing a suit the whole time, never wearing a flag pin.
Right.
And I just think the flag pin is a dumb issue. On the subject of Bill Ayers, though, I think that is interesting. Obama's friendship with him, we know less about that than we do about Reverend Wright. And I will say, even though Tom Shales of the Washington Post said the next day that these questions had been hashed and rehashed, Stephanopoulos said, and I think he's correct, that Obama had never been asked about Ayers in a public way. The subject had been kicking around the conservative blogosphere for quite a while, and I think one thing that irritated people on the left is that Sean Hannity had made a big deal of it, and here was George Stephanopoulos, being a mouthpiece for Sean Hannity. How terrible that was! But this was a legitimate question. I think Ayers is a legitimate question. Obama doesn't have to spend the rest of his life talking about it, but being asked about it was not a bad thing, and I thought his answer was quite interesting, which was, here's a guy, I don't know him all that well. He did bad stuff 40 years ago when I was 8. And besides, I'm friendly with Tom Coburn, too. I thought it was an odd and weak answer, so I'm glad the question was asked, and it had never been asked before in a public forum, to my knowledge. So, flag pin, fine, throw it out. Bill Ayers, I'd like to hear more.
Weak answer, no question. I don't dispute you on that. And obviously, if he's the nominee, he's going to have to come up with better ways to answer these things. But it just, to me, it was just kind of gotcha stuff, because it doesn't really reflect. If you really understand the full profile of the man, I just don't think it reflects at all who he is or the way he sees the world. So he sat on a board. I sat on a board. When I was editor of the American Prospect, it's a nonprofit. We have a board. I went to our board meetings for 3 years, the same number of years as it happens that Obama went to meetings, or we don't even know if he went. Sat on the board of the Woods Fund with Bill Ayers. The Woods Fund, if it's a normal foundation, probably had, 9 meetings in those 3 years, so at most they saw each other 9 times. A lot of times people don't even show up for these board meetings. We have no. It just doesn't amount to that much contact, and it really doesn't amount to that much substantive contact, except for talking about the business of the Woods Fund and what it was up to and what its budget was going to be for the next year. So it just doesn't strike me, unless more is known. It doesn't strike me as much of a relationship.
Well,
that's number one. Number two, if I may,
held at Ayers' house.
Yeah, okay, one time at his house, one time at his house in a political career that has spanned several years, almost a decade or something. Now, the other thing I'd say is that, if you read Obama's books, and remember, one of them was written before he was a politician, so it's presumably a somewhat more honest rendering of his views. But if you read his books, he just makes it very clear that he's not a 60s kind of person, and that's not where he lives. That's not how he thinks. He said repeatedly on the stump that he wants the country to get beyond that. I think he's sincere in saying that. Maybe other people don't. That's fine. But this is not who he is. Now, he was capable. He could have said that just as easily at that debate as I just said it to you. And he was obviously wrong in not saying that kind of thing or giving an answer something like that. And he's going to have to deal with it. But I think hanging this guy around his neck and shortening the relationship, such as it is, with Ayers to a quote-unquote association with the Weather Underground, which is an organization that hasn't even existed for 33 years, and which is a shortening that happens sometimes in journalistic shorthand, is, I think, kind of preposterous.
Well, I will say one thing. The Clinton campaign after this made some use of that, and Howard Wolfson, in his conference calls with reporters, would say, we need to know more about Bill Ayers and all this stuff. And Obama had a great point about Bill Clinton's commutation of the sentences of 2 Weather Underground criminals, and it was actually quite interesting. I think the more culpable of the two was a woman named Susan Rosenberg,
Sure.
Who was arrested, I believe, with about 700 pounds of explosives in her car, and had been involved, perhaps in a getaway kind of way, with a Brinks truck robbery that left 3 people dead, the Brinks guard and 2 policemen.
Yeah, right.
And she was not the shooter or anything, but she was involved as a player in that.
Right.
She goes to jail. She's given a long sentence, I think 58 years. She's arguing and trying to get out in the year 2000, I believe.
Mm-hmm. That's what it was. Yeah.
Prosecutors, what they had done is they had reached a deal in which they didn't prosecute her on the Brinks thing because, in exchange for getting a really long sentence on the explosives thing. So prosecutors are frantic. They're in court trying to make sure that this woman stays in jail for what she's done. And this was in the 1980s, by the way. It wasn't in the 60s or the 70s. It was the 1980s.
Yeah.
And so as prosecutors are in court trying to do this, Bill Clinton ups and commutes her sentence and springs her and the other woman, whose name I believe is Linda Evans.
Mm-hmm.
And so Hillary Clinton's husband has done something, I think, far more substantial for somebody, if we're talking Weather Underground, has done something far more substantial.
Sure.
For 2 former members of the Weather Underground who are also not unrepentant. So she has no standing to make this case. On the other hand, John McCain does, and against either one of them, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, right.
Because at the time, not the later Underground stuff, but at the time the Weather Underground was getting started, John McCain was, as he said in his in that debate in Florida several months ago, he was tied up at the time, and he'll have an excellent argument to make. So here again, I don't think it's a bad thing to bring up in the primaries because it certainly might come up in general election. So Bill Ayers, I think I would like to know more about Obama's relationship. Maybe this is all there is. I don't know.
Yeah.
But Obama has downplayed these things when he gets in trouble about them, which is what a politician does. I mean, he's basically said that he didn't hear any of the particular remarks that Reverend Wright said that were, quote, inflammatory, although he did hear remarks that may be considered that. So Obama has not, I think, faced up to these things head on, and he's going to need to do that. So my feeling is, let's hear more about Bill Ayers. Mm-hmm.
Well, if there's more there, then that might change my opinion. With Hillary, though, you've raised a good question, and she was the senator-elect already in December, I think, of 2000, right. When these pardons were announced, and in
January
fact,
01, I think.
I guess it was January 01.
Out the door.
And also when the Mark Rich pardon was announced.
Okay.
Now, so she's been asked now whether she knew about these Weather Underground pardons, and she said no. And she was asked previously, as I recall, earlier in the primary season, whether she knew about the Mark Rich endorsement or pardon, and she said no. And okay, let's take her at face value and presume that she's telling the truth. But I think that those questions deserve to be examined more and need to be looked at. Is it plausible? I guess it's plausible. Maybe she kind of said, okay, now that I'm the senator-elect, we need to separate our business for these next few months while I put my office together, and don't tell me anything that you're doing, in policy terms, and anything, make sure that I don't know, make sure that there's a shield between your activities and mine. That's possible. But, it's also possible that there was communication and that she knew. And
absolutely. If she's going to base a lot of her campaign on her experience in the White House,
right,
then she's open to being asked about things in the White House.
Yeah, of course. And, there are times, of course, we've seen it. We've both seen it. I mean, there are times when Bill did that, and, it's convenient for her to say, oh, Bill did that. But then there are times when she wants to take a little bit of credit for things. And, the most comical was this crazy idea that she was against NAFTA. I mean, that's hilarious.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But, these pardons, actually, I kind of went back and looked at some, and they were such a treasure trove of misdeeds.
Yeah.
And people got angry about their own particular favorites. Obviously Mark Rich was a big deal. I didn't pay a lot of attention to the Weather Underground people because I was so interested in the Susan McDougal pardon, in which the president pardoned a woman who had gone to jail rather than testify about the truthfulness of his testimony. And so she goes to jail, and then he pardons her, which struck me as an amazing quid pro quo. But because I was so, I guess, obsessed with that one, I didn't pay enough attention to the Weather Underground. Didn't really look at that case until recently.
Yeah, well, I did pay some attention to it because it was pretty. I was in New York City at the time, and it was pretty controversial at the time. And I remember, I think Schumer came out and criticized it, and
Schumer did criticize it, and there were the relatives of the people who were killed in the Brinks thing. Yeah.
That's right.
All right. The last topic, I think, is we've talked all about Democrats, and we haven't said anything about John McCain, who continues to be able to just kind of run a low-key campaign. Since he won the nomination, the Democrats have been fighting. He has gone to the Middle East. He has done his biography tour. He has done an economic plan. And now he is doing this Time for Action tour, in which he's gone to Selma, Alabama, Youngstown, Ohio, and New Orleans in a Katrina-related trip. And so he's been able to sort of do all these things, hopefully raising a lot of money and building up chits, making relationships. And I think the other thing is most important, he's been resting. He only does a couple of events a day, and I mean, he has a lot of stamina, but the campaign is going to come, and it's going to be totally relentless. And while Obama and Clinton are running on fumes, McCain is getting a night's sleep. So all of those things, I think, have been very, very good for him, and he's generally not been getting too much scrutiny because everybody's obsessed with the Democratic race. So I think that's all the good for Republicans, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is, and I think he's handled his this time period pretty well. I mean, I'm not to say that I agree with his economic plan, which I don't, but I mean the series of decisions he's made and the things that he's decided to do and to emphasize, those have been strategically good decisions. So, yeah, I think he's handled it well, and the question of getting rest is a really, really important one. The warning sign for your side that I would see in this, however, is that he's not really expanding a lead over either Clinton or Obama in the national polls as much as one would think he ought to be. That in turn leads me to think that once there is a Democratic nominee, no matter which one it is, maybe they'll get a little bit of a bounce. And McCain will be seen as somehow having squandered this time. I mean, I don't know. He's not doing things that are translating into him nudging himself ahead in the polls, is what I'm saying.
Right. Well, but any lead, if he had it, would be astonishing with the president of his own party, who is at 30%, and people worried very much about the economy. And I believe the Gallup poll yesterday had the highest number, 63%, of people who'd ever said that going into Iraq was a mistake. So having the Republican Party candidate have any lead at the moment, it would be amazing. Although I think all of these numbers are suspect, not because of any hanky-panky, but just because it's not a one-on-one race yet. So people can't focus on that.
So who should he name as vice president?
Oh, well, I think he needs somebody who is 25 years younger than he is, who has executive experience, probably a governor, and somebody, when he announces him, members of the conservative movement will go, yeah, that's good. That's good. Mm-hmm. And failing that, I've begun to think that Mitt Romney wouldn't be a bad choice.
Oh, really?
Because now Mitt Romney certainly is not 25 years younger than McCain. He's just 10 years younger. I believe he's 60 or 61.
Yeah.
But you talk about a guy who's vigorous and looks good for his age. None of us knows whether we are going to live, 8 minutes, 8 more minutes, let alone 8 more years. But believe me, if Mitt Romney keeled over sometime in the next 8 years, I would be surprised.
Right. And Romney can underwrite the campaign. Is that a factor in your thinking?
No. I think the fact that he ran a pretty good campaign, the fact that he has a lot of contacts, and his economic knowledge is not a bad thing. I mean, he could be McCain's smart friend. Talk to my smart friend about that.
Yeah.
I remember being at an event in South Carolina, a couple of them, right before the South Carolina primaries. And McCain was the aforementioned Tom Coburn was who had a big salt and pepper beard for some reason, was campaigning with McCain. So they're going around these small town meetings, and it just happens that at 2 of them in a row, there are detailed questions about health and medical policy.
Right.
And McCain clearly had no idea what the answer was. And it was, hey, talk to my smart friend.
Yeah.
I think that's why we have Dr. Coburn here. And Dr. Coburn knocked them both out of the park. He was very knowledgeable about whatever it was they were.
Yeah.
That doesn't help like in a one-on-one presidential debate. But in the general campaign, I think it wouldn't be a bad idea to have someone like Romney who is so knowledgeable on economic issues and very, very strong on pretty much every aspect of it. So I've been coming around, despite all the bad blood between them, and they didn't like each other. Their campaigns didn't like each other.
Yeah.
But you can get past that, and so I'm thinking that Romney really wouldn't be a bad choice.
Yeah, well, that bad blood was pretty mild, I guess, compared to the bad blood we're seeing now and are going to see probably until June or July.
Well, certainly till May 6th and maybe till June 3rd.
Yep.
And after that, I'd like to take a vacation actually sometime, but we'll see.
Okay.
All right, does that finish up our... Well, we really only had one topic. It was a special all-politics edition today.
What else?
All right.
That's what they want. Okay.
All right, well, I think that finishes it up. Good to talk to you.
Likewise.
And until we talk again.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.